When Marcus received the letter, he almost threw it away, mistaking it for junk mail. A property inheritance from a great-uncle he'd never met. It sounded too good to be true, but after a quick call to the lawyer listed in the letter and confirmation of its legitimacy, his curiosity was piqued. The property was an architectural marvel, a glass house nestled deep in the woods. The idea of a secluded retreat was appealing. Life in the city had become unbearable, with mounting debts and a recent breakup leaving him desperate for an escape. The house sounded like a sanctuary, a chance to start over. When Marcus arrived, the house was more breathtaking than he had imagined. It stood in a clearing, its sleek, transparent walls gleaming under the late afternoon sun. The interior was minimalistic, with modern furniture and an open floor plan that felt luxurious. Yet, there was something unnerving about the endless transparency. There were no curtains, blinds, or walls to provide any privacy. At first, he dismissed the unease as his mind adjusting to the openness. After all, he was alone in the middle of nowhere. Who would be watching? He spent the first evening marveling at his new surroundings. The way the light filtered through the glass, casting shadows that danced across the floor, was mesmerizing. As night fell, the glass walls reflected the interior of the house like a series of infinite mirrors. Outside, the forest became an impenetrable wall of blackness. The first sign of trouble came that night. As Marcus sat on the couch with a glass of wine, he thought he saw movement outside, a shadow slipping between the trees. He stared for several minutes, but nothing appeared. Shaking his head, he blamed his imagination and went to bed. The next night, the shadow returned. This time it was clearer, a tall, human-like figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't step closer. Marcus locked the doors and shut off the lights to reduce the glare on the glass. Peering into the darkness, he could see nothing but trees. By the third night, there were more shadows. 3 figures stood in the clearing, motionless and silent. They didn't approach, but their presence was oppressive, like a weight pressing on his chest. Marcus convinced himself they were just people passing through, or maybe even a prank by locals. He tried to distract himself by exploring the house, but his unease only deepened. The walls groaned faintly at night, a sound he hadn't noticed before. And no matter where he went, he felt exposed, as though unseen eyes followed his every move. The figures multiplied with each passing night. By the end of the week, they formed a ring around the house. Marcus stopped counting after 20. They stood perfectly still, yet their presence was palpable, like a silent audience waiting for a performance to begin. Marcus called the lawyer, demanding answers. "Did my uncle ever mention anything strange about the house?" he asked. The lawyer hesitated. "Your great-uncle was eccentric. He rarely left the property and didn't interact with many people. When he passed away, the house had been empty for weeks before anyone found him." "How did he die?" "Heart attack, as far as I know." "Why do you ask?" Marcus didn't answer. The figures grew bolder. One night, he woke to find them pressed against the glass walls, their shadowy forms rippling like water. He tried to ignore them, but their presence seeped into his mind, disrupting his sleep and eroding his sanity. Desperate, Marcus searched the house for clues. In the basement, he found a dusty journal belonging to his uncle. The entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about the watchers and sleepless nights. The final entry chilled him to the core. "The house isn't mine, it's theirs. I am the entertainment, and they are the audience. I can't leave. No one can." That night, Marcus resolved to confront them. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he stepped outside. The cold air bit at his skin, and his breath fogged in the moonlight. The figures didn't move as he approached, but when he shone the flashlight on the nearest one, it recoiled. The beam revealed its true nature, a flat, featureless shadow that flickered as though caught in a breeze. But as he turned the light away, the figure crept closer. Panic surged through him. He swung the crowbar, but it passed through the shadow like smoke. He retreated to the house, slamming the door behind him, only to find the shadows inside. They seeped through the cracks in the glass, pooling together until they formed towering figures with vaguely human shapes. They surrounded him, their void-like faces tilting as if amused. When morning came, the house was silent. From the outside, it stood pristine, untouched by the chaos of the night. The shadows were gone, and Marcus was nowhere to be found. A week later, a new letter arrived at the lawyer's office. Another distant relative had inherited the property. A group of friends, seasoned kayakers eager for their next adventure, set out to explore a remote area of wilderness far from the comforts of civilization. Armed with maps and enthusiasm, they embarked on what they thought would be a thrilling yet typical weekend. By the second day, however, they stumbled upon an uncharted river, a serpentine stretch of water with a pitch-black surface that shimmered unnaturally, even in the muted daylight, filtering through the dense canopy above. The group hesitated. The river wasn't on any map, and its unsettling color gave them pause. Still, the allure of an untouched, mysterious route was too tempting. They pushed their kayaks into the black water, unaware that they had crossed into a place no one had ever returned from. Paddling downstream, an eerie stillness enveloped them. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the rhythmic splash of their paddles. The water was cold, unnaturally so, and seemed to resist their progress. The deeper they went, the darker the surroundings became, as though the forest itself was retreating from the river. Strange things began to happen. First, it was the absence of their reflections in the water. Then, one of the friends, a skeptic named Jake, swore he saw something beneath the surface, a pale, skeletal face staring up at him, before vanishing into the depths. The others laughed nervously, but their unease grew. As twilight descended, the river became more oppressive. The air thickened with a sulfuric tang, and faint whispers seemed to drift on the breeze, though no one could pinpoint their source. When the group tried to turn back, they discovered the current had grown impossibly strong, pulling them further into the unknown, despite their desperate attempts to paddle against it. Night fell. The black water reflected nothing, not the moon, not the stars, nothing but an endless void. Shapes began to appear along the banks, tall and gaunt figures that seemed to melt into the shadows as quickly as they appeared. One of the kayakers, Sarah, was the first to hear it. A low, guttural sound like breathing, but impossibly loud and coming from everywhere at once. The group's nerves frayed. They yelled at each other, desperate for a solution, but their voices were swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Then, the first attack came. Something large and sinewy shot out of the water, snatching one of the kayaks with an inhumanly strong grip. The kayaker, Mark, screamed as he was dragged under, his cries muffled almost instantly. His friends stared in horror at the bubbling water where he had been, too terrified to move. Panic set in. They paddled furiously, but the river seemed endless. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs that echoed all around them. Another figure appeared, this time directly in their path. A humanoid shape made of writhing shadows, with eyes that glowed like dying embers. It raised an arm, and the river itself responded, churning violently and nearly capsizing their kayaks. Desperate, Sarah grabbed the flashlight strapped to her pack and shone it on the figure. It recoiled, screeching in a language that no human should understand. For a brief moment, the group saw what lay beneath the river's surface. Hundreds of pale, skeletal faces staring upward, their hollow eyes filled with rage and despair. The remaining kayakers knew they had to escape, but the river offered no mercy. Sarah remembered an old superstition her grandmother had told her, that black water was cursed, and only those who offered a sacrifice could be spared. With no time to think, she cut her hand with a pocket knife and let her blood drip into the water. The river hissed and steamed as though in pain, but the current began to slow. They paddled frantically, their strength waning, but their determination fueled by sheer terror. Just as dawn began to break, they found themselves expelled from the river. Their kayaks spat out onto a muddy bank. The black water retreated, as if recoiling from the sunlight, leaving them shivering and gasping for air. Mark was gone, and no one spoke of what they had seen beneath the surface. When they finally reached civilization, they reported the incident, but no one believed them. Weeks later, Sarah began to hear whispers in her sleep, voices calling her back to the Black River. One by one, the survivors disappeared, their belongings left behind, but no trace of their bodies. The river remains uncharted, a cursed place waiting patiently for its next visitors. David had been traveling for hours and was relieved to finally check into the old hotel. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but the heavy rain outside had forced him to seek shelter. The hotel's faded charm was a bit eerie, with its long corridors and dim lighting, but the bed looked inviting, and that was all he needed. He entered his suite, threw his suitcase on the bed, and closed the door. The room was simple, nothing extravagant. But as he walked toward the window to pull the curtains open, he froze. There was a door that hadn't been there before. It stood directly across from the bed, tucked into the far corner of the room, and there was no possible way it could have been there when he checked in. The walls were solid. There had been no mention of any extra rooms on his reservation. Confused, David walked over to the door and tugged on the handle. It was locked. He stepped back and stared at the door, a creeping sense of dread settling in his stomach. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't explain why. With a glance back at the main door, he considered leaving, but something told him to stay. Maybe it was the rain or the late hour. Maybe he just needed sleep. David shrugged it off and returned to the bed. He opened his laptop, trying to distract himself from the unsettling thought of the mysterious door. It was when he glanced at the corner of the room again that he noticed something else. A large mirror hung above a small wooden chair, positioned directly in front of it. He hadn't noticed it earlier, but it was now glaringly obvious. Something about the stillness of the mirror bothered him. The reflection seemed so stark, so perfect. He hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, David stood up and walked toward the mirror. The chair beneath it was empty, but as he stared into the glass, his own reflection began to distort. His image rippled, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a pebble. Then he saw it. A figure, dark and blurry, appeared in the reflection, standing just behind him. David whipped around, but no one was there. His heart thudded in his chest, a chill creeping up his spine. He stared at the mirror again. The figure was still there, but it was closer now, its face obscured by shadow, just inches away from him. David's pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He backed away from the mirror and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "It's just the light," he muttered to himself. "You're tired. It's just your imagination." But the figure didn't go away. It grew clearer with every passing moment. He could make out its face now, pale, gaunt, with eyes too wide and a mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. And then it moved, not just in the mirror but toward him. The reflection's arm reached out as if it was going to touch him, but David turned and ran. He bolted for the main door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he pounded on the door, shouting for help. But the hotel remained eerily silent. He turned back, breathing heavily, and looked toward the mirror. The figure was now standing beside the chair, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, its grin widening as it stared at him. It whispered his name. "David." The voice was low, guttural, almost like a hiss. David stumbled backward, his heart thundering in his chest. He had to get out. He had to leave. He rushed to the door of the mysterious room, the one that hadn't been there before, and tried to force it open. It resisted, but with a frantic twist of the handle, the door creaked open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was exactly as he had imagined it, a perfect replica of his suite, except for one terrifying detail. In the center of the room stood a mirror, identical to the one in his room. The reflection in the mirror was not his own. It was the figure. The same horrifying face, now pressing against the glass, reaching toward him. Its hands scraped at the mirror's surface, leaving deep, dark marks that seemed to bleed into the glass. Suddenly, David realized. The mirror had not just been a reflection, it was a window, a gateway. And the figure in the glass wasn't just a reflection, it was alive. The door slammed shut behind him. Panic gripped his chest as he spun around, desperately searching for a way out. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The figure was no longer in the mirror. It was here. It stepped out of the reflection and into the room, its long fingers stretching toward him. David screamed, but the only sound was the low, eerie chuckle that came from the shadowy figure. And the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the mirror. The doorless room now completely still, reflecting nothing but the eerie, grinning face of the figure, as if it had always been there.